Welcome to this training series from the Pulse Secure Channel team. Today we're going to create and manage our first service on the Traffic Manager. So let's jump in and start creating. Hi there and welcome. The idea of this video is to take you through step by step the processes needed in order to create and manage your first service on the Virtual Traffic Manager. You can see here I've got a Traffic Manager already initially configured, although it doesn't have any services or configuration as such at the moment. Within the next few sections we're going to go through the creation of the various services needed, how we check that configuration, and then how we test the service on the back end. So the first thing we need to do is just go over the general pieces or the sections of config that are needed in order to create and manage a service. These can be found under the Services tab, and they're really just three things really. There's something called a Traffic IP group, a virtual server, and a pool. The Traffic IP group really controls the proxied IP address for a service. So this is the IP address that's raised on the traffic management tier in order that the clients can connect to that IP address, and then we handle those connections to the back end, and the back end servers are actually what we call the pool. So they will be your actual web servers or your application servers on the back end behind us that the clients would originally have connected to without us in place. We are essentially sitting in between the client and the server, or the client and the application, and we are proxying that application in terms of its IP address. So we raise an IP address that is raised and distributed throughout the cluster of traffic managers. In this case we've only got one, so the IP address will only ever be raised on one cluster member. But what a Traffic IP group allows you to do is actually control where that IP address is raised, and it also helps control, or does control rather, that IP address moving from one cluster member to another in case of a cluster member failure. So the IP address is always raised on at least one or more of the cluster members, depending on the mode in which we are running, and that mode is either what we term active passive or active active. Active passive is where the IP address is only raised on one of the group members, one of the cluster members, and active active is where it's raised on more than one cluster member within the cluster at one time. The virtual server is the configuration that then links the pool and the traffic IP together, and is essentially the point at which you configure your application. So in terms of a web service that we're dealing with today, for instance, the virtual server will be configured as listening for HTTP traffic on port 80, and it will be given a name. It will also then link to the Traffic IP group, i.e. the IP address that's going to be raised for that application. And it will also link to the back end in terms of being configured with a particular pool. So the first thing we're going to do initially is to create the pool. Now a pool is simply a number of servers that we have IP connectivity to on the back end that we would like to include in the load balancing algorithm for this particular service. So in this case I'm going to configure 3 pool members, each of which having their own IP address, and they will be basically communicating on port 80. So I'm going to give the pool a name, and in this case we're going to call it Northern Lights, because that is actually the name of the web service or the web application that we are going to connect to. And then I'm going to add the nodes in, and in my case I'm using a DNS environment. You can configure these nodes using IP or DNS, it doesn't really matter. In my particular instance I've got a DNS server running, so they are actually called something. I could in fact type in the IP addresses, but I'll use the DNS for now. So they are called NLWS1, and they reside in the london.pool.com domain. The way we actually enter these, we give them an IP address : port number, or the DNS name : port number, and we separate them with a comma. So NLWS2 london.pool.com on port 80 again, and NLWS3 london.pool.com on port 80. The monitor we'll leave as ping for now, and I'll explain a little about those monitors in a moment. So we'll create the pool. Now that goes ahead and adds 3 pool members to our pool. The state at which they are added is active, so these are currently pool members that will be included in the load balancing algorithm. And basically that's the only configuration we need for basic configuration, at least. You'll see there's a lot more we can do, which I'm not going to cover in this particular video, but at the moment that pool is configured, it's got a name and it's got 3 pool members and they're all active. That's all we need to do for basic configuration. Okay, so that concludes the configuration of the pool. Let's create the traffic IP group. So now we're going to create the traffic IP group, which is the second thing we need to do. So I've configured the pool, as I said in the first video. We move on to the traffic IP group now, and this is essentially the IP address that gets raised, and it's the IP address that would resolve in DNS in an environment. For instance, in our case, when we key in www.northernlightsastronomy.com, this is the IP address that DNS would actually return to the client. So we're going to give it a name, keep it nice and simple, Northern Lights, and we're going to give it the IP address of 192.168.159.105. Now, I mentioned earlier briefly in the previous video that you can control how that IP address gets raised across the cluster. In this particular demonstration, we're just going to raise each address on a single machine, which is what we call single hosted mode. So we'll go ahead and do that. So create traffic IP group, and that's as simple as that. That's the traffic IP group created. You can see there that the IP address has been raised on ENS 160, which is one of the interfaces I'm running on this machine on demo 1. And you can also read here that it's one IP address raised on one traffic manager in single hosted IP mode. Okay, so that concludes the traffic IP group configuration. Now let's create the virtual server configuration. So thirdly, now we need to create the virtual server configuration, which will tie the traffic IP group config and the pool config together. So we'll move to the virtual servers tab, and again we'll call this Northern Lights. Now you'll see here from a drop down you've got a fairly extensible list of protocols that you can include here to represent the protocol that you are going to actually deal with in this particular vServer. All that these do essentially is they inform the traffic manager of the protocol we're going to be dealing with, and that in turn will open certain parts of config. Other parameters in the user interface will become available based on which protocol you're actually using within your virtual server. So we'll select HTTP, we'll listen on port 80, and the default traffic pool for us is going to be Northern Lights, and that's the pool we created just moments ago. So we'll create the virtual server now, and you can see very quickly and easily that's been done. Now at this point, because we've created the traffic IP group and we've linked the pool to this vServer already, what I'm going to go and do ahead now, go ahead and do now is I'm going to add the traffic IP group to this particular vServer and update that. So that traffic IP now of .105 is inherently linked to this particular service. So the vServer for northernlightsastronomy.com is now going to listen on that traffic IP group with its relevant settings, in this case single hosted mode on demo 1 with IP address .105. So in order for me to connect to that service now through the traffic management tier, I need my DNS environment to resolve www.northernlightsastronomy.com to that .105 IP address. Now I've already got that configured locally on my laptop within my hosts file, so I know when I key that into a browser it will resolve to that 105 address already. But that's something to bear in mind. You'll need to actually configure your DNS environment or make sure that your local host file is configured with that particular host file setting. So that's all of the config really needed to configure your service. And if we go back to the home page here now, we'll see that we've got Northern Lights vServer with a Northern Lights pool, And if I start that service now, hopefully everything remains green because it's all configured correctly. We've got the pool with the 3 pool members. We've got Northern Lights listening on HTTP port 80, and that's using .105 in the traffic IP group called Northern Lights. So that concludes our activity for setting up the final part of the 3 sections of config, which is the vServer in this case. Let's check the configuration now. Now for the 4th section of this training session, and that is how we go ahead and check the configuration that we've got. So towards the end of the last section, I was mentioning that Northern Lights looked green. The cluster was saying it was okay, so there were no errors. The first thing to check really is that everything is green and everything is fine. If there were some problems, then this may be in an amber or a red mode, and you would see either the pool or the virtual server as red as well to express that there may be an issue within a portion of that configuration. As you can see, everything looks green, everything looks good, but we will just check the configuration from another standpoint as well. That enables us to then view the config as a whole as well. So if we go into services, and you'll see there the 4th tab next to the pools tab is config summary. And obviously if this was a lot more complicated, this would include a lot more configuration, but as we only have 1 vServer, 1 pool and 1 traffic IP, it's quite a simple configuration. You can see here though, at a glance, everything that we've just configured. So we've got Northern Lights vServer, it's listening on port 80. It's using a pool called Northern Lights, and that consists of these three nodes. And then if we extend here to the right, we would see other parts of configuration as well. You can see the ping monitor that we had in place for the pool members, which I'll come on to in a moment as well. So everything looks good. I should mention that everything you highlight that turns into a link, you can actually link through to, and it will take you to that part of the configuration for you to basically change it and view it there. So if, for instance, I needed to go to the pool, I could come here and click on Northern Lights, and it would just take me straight to the pool config. Okay, that works in a number of places. I can go to the vServer from here. I can go to the Northern Lights traffic IP from here. You know, everything is sort of linked from other user interface pages. So just to go back to this summary page, you can see here we've got a complete summary of config. That's really it for checking the config itself. Just make sure everything's green. This cluster mentions it's okay. I will just take you to this page as well. This takes you to a diagnostics page called Cluster Diagnostics, and you can see here all the parts of configuration on the VTM that are all good. So if there were an issue with any part of these, you would see a red X here instead of a green tick, and then you could drill down into that particular part of the configuration and see what problem was occurring. And again, everything navigable here. I can go to the pool configuration as I did before. So really, once that's checked, you know that everything's green, we're good to go. So the final part of this video is coming up, and that's basically how we then test the service. So I'll show you that in a moment. Now let's go ahead and test the service. So last time I left you at this cluster diagnostics page, everything green, all good. So we've checked the configuration. Now in this section we'll just be testing the service, and that's really as simple as making sure that your environment is configured to actually resolve the IP address of the service, either using the local host file as I've got configured on my laptop here, or your DNS environment actually resolves to the correct address. So the address we want to actually resolve within the DNS world or the host file is the one that's advertised from the vServer using this traffic IP group here. And as I explained earlier, that's the .105 address. So in my host file on this laptop, for instance, when I key in www.northernlights.com into a browser, my host file has an entry that resolves it to the .105 address. So very simply put, that now means if I go to this tab here and I key in northernlightsastronomy.com, I receive this particular website, which is in fact the website behind the traffic manager. And you can see it's being served here. That traffic now that I'm creating should actually be passing through the traffic manager, and we can confirm that actually by going to the activity screen and viewing the bandwidth chart. Now if I generate some traffic with this screen in place, so if I just click around, you'll see I'm generating some traffic, and then we go back to the traffic manager. You can see that the traffic is coming through the VTM and being handled on the back end to those 3 nodes, load balanced by whichever algorithm we have in place for that particular pool. So that really concludes this this training session of how to manage your first service on the traffic manager. Thanks very much for listening. Cheers. Bye bye.